Now let's go into the management console and take a look at authentication modes and how to manipulate those. I've put a shortcut to the SQL Server Management Studio on my desktop. Let me show you how I did that just in case I can save you a step here. If you just go to the Management Studio in the list, right click it, drag it to your desktop, release it and say copy here, it will put a copy. Now if I just double click this, it opens the SQL Server Management Studio. So notice I'm just going to connect in. Now once I'm inside here, I want to show you how to get to this. Notice that I've got the Object Explorer open, and again, if you can't see that, go to View and choose Object Explorer, or you can hit F8. So notice on here is my server, my Leesburg Mark server. Well, if I want to, first of all, check to see what authentication mode I have here, if I right-click this and go to Properties, you will notice that I get the properties, and down the left here is kind of like a navigation bar. Well, if I look at security, you'll notice that I'm in Windows authentication mode. So if you remember from an earlier video, then that means that if we connect to Active Directory, we're going to have to map people in. And I'll show you how to do that in just a second. If I want to make it SQL Server in Windows, I can change it. Now, if I change it and hit OK, notice what's going to happen. It'll tell me it won't take effect until SQL Server is restarted. Okay, so I'm going to change that back. So keep in mind, if you ever want to change these connection modes or authentication modes, your SQL Server will have to be restarted before they actually take effect. Now, let me show you what I was talking about a little earlier in a previous video. There are two levels to security. Number one is to the server. So here is our server. Here's our SQL Server. And if I go into the security tab or the security folder here, you will see the logins. These are the people or the groups who can connect to SQL Server. And let me show you. Let's create a new one. If I right click on logins and choose new login, you will notice the login dialog box pops up, and it's asking me, okay, what login do you want to let in? Well, on Windows Authentication, I can search. And notice I can simply search from Active Directory. Okay, so if I go to Advanced and do Find Now, notice it's found Active Directory. And I can grab groups out here and say, okay, anybody in part of that particular group, for example, I could say everyone. Okay, now I'm about to map everyone into my server. I don't want to do that, so I'm going to stop at this point. So I'll stop that. Now, I want to show you a SQL Server login. If I want to do a SQL Server login, notice I'm going to go up here and give it a login name. And I'll just call him Frank. And I'll give Frank a password. And we won't worry about anything else. And OK it. Now notice, here's Frank. Frank is now a login. Frank can log in using his password and connect to SQL Server. But what databases can Frank go into? So let me go into databases here. And I will go into my database. I created one called Sales. We'll go through database creation in a different video. But notice in my database Sales that I have a folder here called Security. Okay, now make sure you catch this. On my SQL Server, I have a folder called Security. Then inside my Sales database, I have a folder called Security. And in here, there are my users. And if I click on Users or expand it, you'll notice these are the people who can currently come into this database. Well, Frank can't come in, so I want to add him as a user. He can come into the SQL Server, so I say New User, and I want you to notice something. If I want to add Frank to this database, notice I can go out here and search, and I want you to notice the users who can come in are only those who can get onto the SQL Server. So these guys can get onto the SQL Server, so now I can let them come into this particular database. So I OK that, and you'll notice Frank is now a login. Oh, got to use a name here. And so now Frank can log into the database. We haven't set permissions. We'll deal with that later. But I wanted you to see and get a visual on how these logins work together and how you set them up and how you change these authentication modes.